Are you looking to buy the new MacBook Pro 14-inch, but you're confused about which one to buy? More CPU, less CPU, more memory, less memory, more, less. Oh, maybe more storage, less storage, more storage, less storage, more, less, more, less, more, less, more, less.
Yo, enough! I have the solution for you. The MacBook Pro base model. It's the best in its class and it's gonna be the best laptop for you. I promise. Welcome back to the channel. So I've been using the new MacBook Pro 14-inch base model for more than 1 month, and this will be my long-term review. A small note about me and the channel: I like making long-term reviews because I feel that to know a product and deliver an honest and detailed opinion, you need to use it for quite some time and discover some issues or good things that you did not know about it. Without further ado, let's get to it. So design-wise, the new MacBook Pro comes with a sleek-looking aluminum chassis in a relatively thicker-looking enclosure. It's like a redesigned version of the mid-2000 MacBook Pros. It's also a perfect blend of all the new, and I really dig it. The laptop is pretty lightweight too, coming at only 3.5 pounds. It's heavier than a MacBook Air, but I find that it's still easy to carry around. One change that I really like is the black keyboard bed. It just looks great with the aluminum contrast. Apple removed the touch bar, and I would just say good riddance. I was never a fan. Instead, we got some good old full-size function keys. Typing experience on this MacBook is good with enough travel, and the keystroke seems to be slightly more muffed. The feedback is very precise, but I would have liked a longer travel. Overall, I would say it's a very good typing experience. The Touch ID fingerprint scanner in the power button on the top right corner now has an additional ring, but the functionality is still the same compared to previous models. The engravings on the bottom is really cool, and it gives it that extra premium care you would expect from Apple. Now, this is where we start to see some really cool changes compared to the previous MacBooks. Since 2016, Apple was very aggressive with its move to replace every port with USB-C, and that was the birth of the dongle life. But finally, with this MacBook Pro, Apple came back to their senses and realized that Pro users actually need some of those ports for their work. So this MacBook features 3 Thunderbolt 4 USB-C ports, 1 HDMI port, an SDXC card slot, a 3.5mm headphone jack, and a MagSafe 3 port. Unfortunately, the HDMI port is not 2.1, but I guess that won't matter for a lot of people. The SD card reader is UHS 2 with speeds up to 250 megabits per second. Again, it's not the latest UHS 3 standard, but when I asked my filmmaker friends, they said that it's more than enough for their cameras. So with all these ports at your disposal, you can connect up to 2 Pro Display XDRs with the M1 Pro. The new sound system with 6 speakers is currently the best system you can get in a mobile device, and it can easily replace inexpensive external speakers. Windows laptops don't even come close to this level of clarity and loudness. The modules are even louder and more powerful, which is also represented by the improved bass coverage. It's all balanced, as it should be. Take a listen for yourself. So the base model MacBook Pro 14-inch comes with Apple M1 Pro with 8-core CPU, 14-core GPU, and 16-core neural engine. It also comes with 16 GB of unified memory, 512 GB SSD storage, and 67 watt USB-C power adapter. Now, at around $2,000, it's not a cheap laptop. But then again, that's why you're watching this video, to know whether it's worth it or not. So in my own battery benchmark, I played a looped 1080p video until the battery ran out. I found it lasted an impressive 16 hours. Not too far away from the Apple 17 hours claim. The battery will of course drain faster if you're using a higher brightness, or if you're using the system to the max, say for example editing 4K videos. Overall, I'm quite pleased with the battery life considering how much power is packed in the M1 Pro SoC. Now this is where the controversy starts, especially with the display notch. Honestly, I don't have an issue with the notch. After a while, I got used to it, and there is a neat trick with dark wallpapers. It will make it kind of disappear. Having said that, I can understand that some people might be turned off by it at first glance. It was a fun subject for me to discuss, and my short video about the mouse cursor behavior went viral in only 2 days, up to 145,000 views. Aside from the notch, the display itself is gorgeous. It's an XDR display, just like the Pro Display XDR, and comes with the mini LEDs that can manage extremely low black levels, which results in a very contrasty ratio, very close to OLED levels. Call me impressed. It can reach a peak brightness of 16,000 nits, with a sustained brightness of 1,000 nits, but only when viewing HDR content in some program like Safari or Final Cut Pro. In normal viewing experience, the display mostly runs at a max of 500 nits, same as previous MacBook Pros. This is a full coverage DCI-P3 Apple display after all, so color production, accuracy is top notch. No pun intended. With a delta E less than 2, there is no need for calibration out of the box, so you can start editing your photos or videos straight away. What really sold me this year for the display, and especially the MacBook Pro itself, is the Pro Motion, with a variable refresh rate of up to 120 Hz. It's a similar technology to what you would find on the iPad Pro or the new iPhone 13 Pro models. The system automatically decides when to increase the refresh rate, like when you scroll through a document, while it is reduced or static for some images to save power. You can also set a fixed frequency if required in the display setting. So as a PC gamer used to 144 Hz monitor, as well as my OnePlus 8 Pro at 120 Hz, this was a big deal for me, and one of the reasons I held off buying a new MacBook Pro until now. For most people, this is not a big concern, but it's like one of those things that once you try them, you can't really go back. The new 1080p webcam on the MacBook Pro isn't amazing by any means, but it's a huge step up from the embarrassment of a webcam that shipped with the MacBook Pro for years. It's more or less on par with the new 24-inch M1 iMac now as far as quality goes, and that's nothing to complain about, as you can see here. So this is what the microphone on the MacBook Pro sounds like. I'm not really sure it's the studio quality that Apple kind of proclaimed it was, but it's decent enough for a Zoom or a Skype call. I still wish that the MacBook came with Face ID because it makes so much sense on a laptop, and the notch would be justified for it. Now let's move on to the juicy part. That is the performance of the M1 Pro. When running the typical Geekbench 5, we get 1760 for the single core and 9956 for the multi-core score. OpenCL score is 34,009 and Metal is 38,776. The CPU numbers are impressive compared to the previous M1, and of course more impressive than my beefy Intel Hackintosh. However, the GPU performance is still less that on the 5700 XT, and it's more than double the M1. Using the CPU stress test and TG Pro temperature monitor, we can see that after 100% load in 5 minutes, the average computer temperature reaches 74 degrees Celsius, and you can slightly hear the fans working, which means that overall the performance is great when it comes to thermals.
Now, when it comes to the SSD performance on this MacBook Pro, it's one of the fastest I've ever seen on a laptop, with read and write speeds averaging between 5 and 6 gigabits per second. Nothing you throw at it in terms of workflow can slow it down. This benchmark is designed to test the speed of decoding full-resolution Blackmagic RAW frames on the system. Multiple CPU scores and GPUs are automatically detected and used during this test. As you can see, the results are quite pleasing. We get 22 FPS with 8K CPU decoding and 150 FPS with 8K metal decoding. As for 4K decoding, we get 88 FPS with CPU and 587 FPS with metal. Basically, if you are using Blackmagic RAW files, you don't have to worry about performance. Blender CPU render benchmark test is based on one of Blender's built-in render engine, or what we call cycles. In this one, we benchmarked the BMW scene. The rendering took only 4 minutes and 30 seconds, which is way less than what we got with the M1 Air, which took more than 7 minutes. Cinebench R23 is a popular benchmarking tool to measure the CPU rendering performance. It renders a complex 3D model of a room. The scores are as follows. We get 1529 points for single core and 9570 points for multi-core, which puts it between the M1 and my Intel Hackintosh. Affinity Photo includes a benchmark to test your device vector and raster performance. The benchmark assesses the capability of the CPU to perform vector operations. We get 14,627 for the combined score, which is double the M1 score. The Unigine Heaven benchmark is a GPU-intensive benchmark that hammers graphic cards to the limit. Even though it's an old benchmark, it can be effectively used to determine the stability of a GPU under extremely stressful conditions. In this test, we get 79 FPS and a score of 1997, which is more than double the M1. GFX Bench is the first performance benchmark to support low-level APIs, such as Metal. And GFX Bench is designed for measuring sustained long-term graphic performance and the render quality. In this test, we got exactly double the M1 performance. I use Final Cut Pro for my own videos, and while testing different files, I didn't see any frame drops or stuttering. The first test has 4K footage from the Blackmagic Pocket Cinema 4K, and the second one is from the infamous Canon R5 120 FPS footage. That's really taxing on the CPU and the decoder. In both cases, as you can see, I'm using full resolution in the preview, and scrubbing is extremely smooth. Even my beefy Hackintosh cannot match that. It's mostly due to the new media engines inside the M1 Pro SoC. For DaVinci Resolve, I wanted to test the 6K footage from the Blackmagic Pocket Cinema, and again, scrubbing was extremely smooth in full resolution, as you can see. I guess that's also due in part to the optimized Blackmagic RAW codec and the updated DaVinci Resolve that supports the M1 Pro. Now, when it comes to Premiere Pro, I'm not really a big fan, but some of you might be interested in using it. So I used the red 8K footage to test this, and this is where things start to fall apart. The performance is not great in full resolution, and in half resolution the stuttering is very obvious. I know that for editing 8K videos you can just use lower preview resolutions, but this is a performance test after all, and it shows that Adobe did not really optimize their software. When it comes to Lightroom Classic, importing photos took only a few seconds, and the preview was fast enough to jump in and develop your photos immediately, as you can see. I don't know why, but it seems that After Effects is not well optimized on the M1 Pro, since I'm getting better performance on my Hackintosh with the same file. In fact, most Adobe apps are poorly optimized, even though they said they have 5 times the performance now. Motion performance was incredibly smooth and didn't see any stutter or longer render time, which makes sense since we saw the same thing with Final Cut Pro. In this Logic Pro test, we see how many tracks the system can handle before being overloaded. In this case, the M1 Pro with 16GB of memory can handle up to 118 tracks from the original 128. By comparison, my Hackintosh with 32GB of RAM could handle all the tracks easily. This is an Xcode build time test for Firefox using Homebrew. If you are a developer, then this is interesting for you. It was actually incredibly fast. It took only 84 seconds to build the nightly version of Firefox, while the M1 was way slower. It took more than 1000 seconds. So let's assume you want to launch all the apps in your dock one after the other. With the M1 Pro, you won't see any slowdowns. This is expected since the M1 of last year was also so fast. It actually puts Intel to shame.
All in all, I would say that the base model MacBook Pro 14-inch is more than capable in most cases, and of course in most workflows. Unless you are a 3D designer or you work with a lot of 8K videos, then there is really no reason to get the M1 Max. If you have the cash for it and you want to future-proof your MacBook Pro, I would highly recommend spending more money on RAM rather than storage. However, for most of us, the 16GB unified memory is more than enough, as you have seen in the performance test. So I hope this video answered your questions about the base model MacBook Pro and whether you want to buy it or not. I will be making a direct comparison of the MacBook Pro with the M1 MacBook Air, as well as my Hackintosh. So stay tuned for that video by liking this one and subscribing to the channel. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next one.